In 2003, a routine truancy investigation in rural Kentucky led social workers to a discovery so shocking that it would challenge everything they thought they knew about the limits of human depravity and genetic horror. What they found hidden in a remote compound wasn't just a case of educational neglect or poverty. It was evidence of the most twisted family structure ever documented in American history, where two sisters had spent 8 years systematically bearing children to each other's husbands, who were also their own brothers. The 12 children living in this nightmare weren't just victims of abuse. They were the products of a genetic catastrophe so deliberate and so extreme that it defied nature itself. This is the story of Sarah and Mary Beth Coleman, sisters who turned incest into a family tradition and created a bloodline so damaged that science could barely explain how their children had survived. Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the darkest tales hidden in plain sight. And after you've subscribed, write in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Together we are building a community of night watchers who face these chilling stories side by side, no matter the distance. Now, let's continue with the story. The morning of October 15th, 2003, started like any other for social worker Jennifer Hayes. She was driving through the backwoods of Harlan County, Kentucky, following up on a truancy report about children who hadn't been seen in school for over 2 years. The address led her down increasingly narrow dirt roads until she reached a compound that seemed frozen in time. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her career. The property consisted of a single large wooden structure that barely qualified as a house, surrounded by makeshift outbuildings and debris that suggested the residents had been living completely outside the boundaries of modern society. But it wasn't the primitive living conditions that made Hayes call for backup. It was the children she encountered when she knocked on the door. 12 kids ranging from toddlers to teenagers answered her knock, and every single one displayed obvious signs of severe genetic damage. Their faces were marked by the telltale signs of inbreeding: enlarged foreheads, misshapen jaws, and eyes that didn't quite focus properly. Some could barely speak, despite being school age. Others moved with the unsteady gait of people whose nervous systems had never developed correctly. Hayes had seen poverty and neglect before, but this was something entirely different. This was biological catastrophe on a scale that suggested generations of genetic manipulation. When 4 adults finally emerged from the house, Hayes realized she was looking at 2 couples who bore such strong family resemblances that they could only be siblings. The men, James and Daniel Coleman, appeared to be in their early 30s, but moved with the slow, careful steps of people much older. The women, Sarah and Mary Beth Coleman, looked worn down by years of constant pregnancy and childbirth. All 4 adults displayed the same genetic markers as the children, though to a lesser degree. Their facial features showed the subtle but unmistakable signs of inbreeding that had been accumulating in their family line for decades. What made Hayes call for immediate assistance wasn't just the obvious genetic damage. It was the way the family interacted. The children called both men Daddy and both women Mama, without any apparent understanding of normal family relationships. The adults spoke to each other with an intimacy that suggested relationships far more complex than simple marriage. And when Hayes asked about the children's fathers, she received answers that made her blood run cold. Each child was claimed by multiple parents in combinations that violated every principle of normal human reproduction. As more social workers and law enforcement officers arrived at the scene, they began to piece together a family structure so twisted that it challenged their ability to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a case of isolated poverty or religious extremism. This was evidence of systematic genetic manipulation that had been going on for nearly a decade, creating a bloodline so compromised that the children represented living proof of what happens when human beings treat reproduction like a science experiment conducted without any understanding of the consequences. As social workers delved deeper into their investigation, they uncovered a family structure so twisted and deliberately engineered that it defied every principle of normal human relationships and genetic health. Sarah Coleman had married her brother James in 1995 when she was 20 years old and he was 22. Just 2 years later, their sister Mary Beth married their other brother Daniel in what the family described as a double blessing that would keep their bloodline pure and concentrated. But these weren't traditional marriages by any definition that civilized society would recognize. Within months of the second wedding, both couples had established a system where the wives were systematically shared between both husbands, creating a reproductive arrangement that turned genetic disaster into a deliberate family practice. The investigation revealed that Sarah and Mary Beth had developed what they called the rotation, where each woman would spend alternating months living as wife to both brothers. During Sarah's month with James, Mary Beth would live with Daniel, but the following month, they would switch partners completely. This wasn't occasional adultery or relationship confusion. This was a calculated system designed to ensure that both women remained constantly pregnant by both men, maximizing what the family believed was genetic purity, while actually creating the most extreme genetic bottleneck ever documented in American family history. The children born from this arrangement had no clear understanding of which man was their biological father, because DNA testing was forbidden in the household as interference with God's will. Brothers were simultaneously cousins. Sisters were also half-sisters, through different father-uncle combinations, and family relationships had become so tangled that even the adults couldn't always explain how the children were related to each other. Social worker Jennifer Hayes discovered that the family kept detailed charts tracking which woman was with which man during conception periods, but these records were written in a code that combined religious references with abbreviations that made them nearly impossible to decipher. What became clear was that both Sarah and Mary Beth had been pregnant almost continuously since their marriages, producing 12 children in 8 years, while maintaining sexual relationships with both brothers throughout most of their pregnancies. The genetic consequences of this systematic inbreeding were immediately visible in every child. Each successive birth had produced more severe abnormalities as the family's already compromised gene pool became increasingly concentrated. The oldest children showed relatively minor signs of genetic damage, but the youngest displayed catastrophic developmental problems that suggested the family's reproductive system was approaching the absolute limits of human biological survival. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the geneticist called in to evaluate the family, described their breeding pattern as the most extreme case of deliberate genetic concentration she had ever encountered outside of laboratory experiments designed to study the effects of inbreeding on animal populations. The family had essentially turned themselves into a closed breeding system where genetic diversity had been eliminated so completely that beneficial genes had no chance of survival, while harmful mutations were amplified with each generation. What made the situation even more disturbing was the discovery that this wasn't the result of ignorance or accident. The family had deliberately chosen this reproductive strategy based on their interpretation of religious teachings about maintaining pure bloodlines. They viewed their genetic isolation as a sacred duty, and the resulting abnormalities in their children as tests of faith rather than consequences of biological laws. The adults explained to investigators that sharing wives between brothers was practiced in biblical times, and that their children's disabilities were evidence of their special status as chosen people who had been marked by God for a higher purpose. This religious justification had allowed them to continue their destructive breeding practices, even as each new birth brought more obvious evidence that they were creating genetic catastrophe rather than genetic purity. The twisted family structure that social workers discovered in 2003 didn't develop by accident or through gradual isolation. It was the deliberate creation of William Coleman, a religious extremist who had spent decades planning and implementing what he believed was God's design for a pure bloodline. William had moved his family to rural Harlan County in 1976 when his children were still young, purchasing 50 acres of remote mountain land where he could raise his offspring according to his own interpretation of biblical teachings about genetic purity and family loyalty. William was a man obsessed with Old Testament stories about patriarchs who married within their families to preserve chosen bloodlines. He spent hours studying passages about Abraham marrying his half-sister Sarah, Isaac marrying his cousin Rebekah, and Jacob taking sisters as wives. But William's interpretation went far beyond what even the most fundamentalist religious scholars would accept. He believed that modern Christianity had been corrupted by outside influences, and that true believers were called to return to the practices of biblical times, including marriage between close relatives to concentrate God's blessings within pure family lines. By the early 1980s, William had begun preparing his children for what he called the sacred plan. James, Daniel, Sarah, and Mary Beth were homeschooled using curriculum that William created himself, focusing heavily on religious instruction that emphasized family loyalty above all other values. The children were taught that outsiders were contaminated by sin, and that marrying within the family was not just acceptable, but required by God to maintain their special status as chosen people. William's plan became more specific as his children reached adolescence in the late 1980s. He arranged the marriages between his sons and daughters, but added a crucial element that even biblical polygamy hadn't included. He established what he called the sharing covenant, where wives would be exchanged between brothers to ensure maximum genetic concentration and prevent any child from having only one male parent within the family line. William justified this system by claiming that since his sons were brothers in blood and faith, sharing wives would double the blessing on each child and create offspring who carried the genetic heritage of multiple patriarchs within the same generation. The religious framework that William created for his plan was elaborate and internally consistent, even though it violated every principle of genetics and social structure. He taught his children that each pregnancy resulting from the sharing system was a sacred act that concentrated God's chosen genetics while eliminating the corruption that came from outside bloodlines. He convinced them that the disabilities appearing in their children were actually signs of divine favor, marking them as different from ordinary humans and closer to the angelic beings described in biblical visions. William's control over his children was absolute because he had isolated them from birth and controlled every aspect of their education and worldview. They had no frame of reference for normal family relationships or understanding that their father's teachings represented extreme deviation from accepted religious practice. By the time they reached adulthood, James, Daniel, Sarah, and Mary Beth genuinely believed that their incestuous marriages and shared reproductive arrangements were acts of religious devotion that would earn them special favor in the afterlife. The compound that William built reflected his paranoid worldview and determination to prevent outside interference. He constructed hidden rooms, maintained detailed surveillance of the property perimeter, and established protocols for dealing with visitors that emphasized secrecy and misdirection. William died in 1998, but his children continued following his plan with religious dedication, viewing their father's teachings as sacred doctrine that must be maintained regardless of the consequences for their offspring. The genetic disaster that unfolded over the next 5 years was the direct result of William's deliberate manipulation of his children's beliefs and his systematic destruction of their ability to recognize the difference between religious devotion and biological catastrophe. The systematic grooming of William Coleman's children began when they were barely old enough to understand the concept of marriage, but it accelerated dramatically during their teenage years in the 1990s when their father's twisted vision began to take concrete shape. James, born in 1973, Daniel in 1975, Sarah in 1975, and Mary Beth in 1977, had spent their entire childhoods isolated from the outside world and indoctrinated with William's interpretation of biblical family structure. By the time they reached adolescence, they had no understanding that their father's teachings represented extreme deviation from normal human relationships. The children's education had been carefully designed to normalize incestuous relationships through constant exposure to Old Testament stories presented without the historical and cultural context that mainstream religious education provided. William taught them that Abraham's marriage to his half-sister was the model for all godly unions, that Isaac's arranged marriage to his cousin demonstrated divine approval of family intermarriage, and that Jacob's relationships with the sisters Rachel and Leah proved that sharing spouses between family members was blessed by God. By the time James turned 18 in 1991, he had been conditioned to view marriage to his sister Sarah as his religious destiny rather than a violation of natural law. The first marriage ceremony took place in 1995 when Sarah turned 20 and James was 22. William conducted the service himself, using a combination of biblical passages and his own religious interpretations that framed the union as a sacred act of genetic purification. The ceremony was attended only by immediate family members and included vows that bound the couple not just to each other, but to the larger family plan that would require Sarah to bear children by multiple male relatives. Sarah's first pregnancy in 1996 produced a son who showed subtle but unmistakable signs of genetic damage. The infant had a slightly enlarged head, delayed motor development, and learning difficulties that became apparent as he grew older. But instead of recognizing these as warning signs of genetic problems, the family interpreted them as evidence that the child was special and marked by God for a higher purpose. The success of the first marriage in producing offspring, regardless of their genetic condition, encouraged William to proceed with the second phase of his plan. Daniel married Mary Beth in 1997 in another private ceremony that emphasized family loyalty and genetic concentration over traditional marriage vows. Mary Beth's first pregnancy later that year produced a daughter whose genetic abnormalities were more pronounced than her older cousins, including severe speech delays and coordination problems that required constant supervision. By 1998, both couples had produced multiple children, and William had introduced the sharing system that would define the family's reproductive strategy for the next decade. The brothers were taught that sharing their wives was an act of spiritual brotherhood that doubled the blessing on each child and ensured that the family's genetic heritage would be concentrated rather than diluted. The wives were conditioned to view the arrangement as their sacred duty and a privilege that allowed them to serve multiple patriarchs within the same household. The early years of the sharing system produced children with increasingly severe genetic damage, but the family's isolation and religious conditioning prevented them from understanding the connection between their breeding practices and their children's disabilities. Each new birth was celebrated as evidence of God's favor, while the growing medical problems were attributed to spiritual tests that demonstrated the family's special status as chosen people. The children born during this period would grow up never knowing normal family relationships, never understanding that their parents were also their aunts and uncles, and never learning that their severe learning disabilities and physical problems were the predictable result of generations of genetic concentration rather than divine blessing. By 2000, the first generation of William's plan had produced 8 children whose collective medical problems represented a catalog of genetic disasters. But the family remained convinced that they were fulfilling God's will and creating a pure bloodline that would inherit special spiritual gifts denied to the contaminated outside world. Between 1995 and 2003, Sarah and Mary Beth Coleman produced 12 children whose birth records read like a medical textbook on the catastrophic effects of systematic inbreeding. Each pregnancy was carefully planned and coordinated between the sisters, who had developed an elaborate system of shared care that ensured both women remained pregnant almost continuously throughout their reproductive years. The family viewed this constant cycle of pregnancy and birth as evidence of divine blessing, but medical experts would later describe it as one of the most extreme examples of deliberate genetic manipulation ever documented in American family history. The first child, born to Sarah and James in 1996, showed relatively minor signs of genetic damage. Michael had a slightly enlarged head and mild developmental delays, but the family interpreted these as signs of special intelligence rather than genetic problems. The second child, born to Mary Beth and Daniel 6 months later, displayed more pronounced abnormalities, including severe speech delays and coordination problems that required constant supervision. But instead of recognizing a pattern, the family celebrated each birth as proof that their genetic concentration was producing children marked by God for special purposes. By 1998, both sisters had established what they called the pregnancy covenant, where they coordinated their cycles to ensure that one woman was always in the early stages of pregnancy, while the other was giving birth or recovering. This system was designed to maximize genetic concentration by ensuring that children were born as close together as possible, while maintaining the sharing arrangement between both brothers. The sisters tracked their ovulation cycles using charts that combined religious symbols with fertility indicators, treating conception as a sacred science that required precise timing and spiritual preparation. The middle years of the birth pattern produced children with increasingly severe disabilities. The fifth child, born in 1999, had such severe cognitive impairments that he never learned to speak beyond primitive grunts and gestures. The seventh child, born in 2000, displayed physical deformities, including a malformed spine and limbs that developed incorrectly due to genetic mutations that had accumulated in the family's DNA over multiple generations of inbreeding. Each new birth brought more obvious evidence of genetic collapse, but the family's religious conditioning prevented them from making the connection between their breeding practices and their children's disabilities. Sarah and Mary Beth had developed an elaborate support system for managing multiple pregnancies and caring for disabled children simultaneously. They shared all child-rearing responsibilities, without regard for biological parentage, creating a household where every adult was responsible for every child, and where traditional parent-child bonds were replaced by collective care arrangements. The sisters often nursed each other's babies and made medical decisions jointly, treating the 12 children as products of a communal reproductive effort rather than individual families. The later children born after 2000 showed genetic damage so severe that their survival defied medical understanding. The 10th child suffered from multiple organ defects that required constant medical attention the family couldn't provide. The 11th child was born with such severe neurological problems that she remained in a vegetative state throughout her short life. The 12th and final child, born in 2003, just months before the discovery, displayed the most extreme genetic abnormalities yet seen in the family, including massive head enlargement and internal organ malformations that would prove fatal within the first year of life. Despite the increasingly obvious evidence that their reproductive system was producing genetic catastrophe, the family remained convinced that each birth fulfilled God's plan for concentrated bloodlines. They interpreted their children's disabilities as evidence of divine selection rather than biological failure, and they continued their breeding practices even as the genetic damage reached levels that threatened the survival of future offspring. The birth pattern that emerged over 8 years represented systematic genetic manipulation conducted without any understanding of the scientific principles involved, creating a bloodline so compromised that medical experts would later struggle to explain how many of the children had survived the prenatal development process. The sisters' dedication to their reproductive covenant had created what geneticists would describe as a controlled experiment in human inbreeding depression, conducted on a scale and with a level of systematic planning that challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of genetic damage compatible with human survival. Daily life in the Coleman compound operated according to a rigid schedule that revolved around the family's twisted interpretation of biblical household management and their systematic breeding practices. The main dwelling was a sprawling wooden structure that William had expanded repeatedly over the years to accommodate his growing vision of a multi-generational family compound. The house contained 6 bedrooms arranged in a configuration that facilitated the sharing arrangements between the two couples, with James and Daniel occupying separate master bedrooms, while Sarah and Mary Beth moved between them according to the monthly rotation schedule that governed their reproductive duties. The children slept in communal dormitory-style rooms divided by gender rather than family relationships, since traditional parent-child bonds had been deliberately dissolved in favor of collective child-rearing arrangements. Every aspect of daily routine was governed by religious rituals that reinforced the family's belief in their special status as chosen people, following God's original design for pure bloodlines. Morning prayers included specific thanksgiving for the concentration of divine genetics within their family, and requests for continued fertility to produce more children marked by God's favor. Meals were communal affairs where the adults took turns reading from William's handwritten religious texts that justified their practices through selective biblical quotations and elaborate theological arguments that portrayed incest as a sacred duty rather than a violation of natural law. The family's isolation was maintained through careful screening of all outside contact and systematic indoctrination that portrayed the external world as contaminated by sin and genetic corruption. The children were taught that people outside their family were spiritually and biologically inferior, infected by generations of mixing with unclean bloodlines that had diluted their connection to God's original creation. Television, radio, and outside reading materials were strictly forbidden to prevent exposure to ideas that might challenge their understanding of normal family relationships. The few times that government officials or neighbors approached the compound, the family had rehearsed responses that deflected questions about their living arrangements and presented a facade of conventional religious observance. The sexual arrangements that governed the adults' relationships were presented to the children as evidence of their family's advanced spiritual development and closer approximation to the polygamous practices of biblical patriarchs. Sarah and Mary Beth were taught to view their shared reproductive duties as a form of religious service that demonstrated their devotion to God's plan for concentrated genetics. The monthly rotation between husbands was ritualized through prayer ceremonies that blessed each transition and framed the exchange as a sacred act that doubled the spiritual power flowing through their offspring. The children grew up believing that their family structure was not just normal, but superior to the corrupted arrangements they might encounter in the outside world. The household economy was entirely self-sufficient by design, with the family producing their own food, making their own clothing, and avoiding all outside employment that might expose them to contaminating influences. William had established this isolation as essential to maintaining the purity of their bloodline and preventing outside interference with God's plan for their genetic concentration. The children were assigned work responsibilities from an early age, but their obvious disabilities meant that even simple tasks required constant supervision and assistance from the adults. Education within the compound focused exclusively on religious instruction that reinforced their understanding of family loyalty and genetic purity as divine mandates. The children learned to read using only biblical texts and William's religious writings, preventing them from accessing information that might help them understand the abnormality of their situation. Mathematics and science were taught only as they related to biblical numerology and creation stories, ensuring that the children never encountered genetic principles that might explain their disabilities or challenge their family's practices. The family's medical care was entirely self-administered, using prayer and herbal remedies that William believed were sufficient for treating any health problems that arose in their blessed bloodline. Professional medical attention was viewed as evidence of insufficient faith and potential exposure to outside authorities who might not understand their religious practices. This isolation from medical care meant that the children's genetic conditions went undiagnosed and untreated, allowing their disabilities to worsen over time, while reinforcing the family's belief that their suffering was evidence of divine testing, rather than biological consequences of systematic inbreeding. When social workers first encountered the 12 Coleman children in 2003, they were witnessing the devastating human cost of 8 years of systematic genetic manipulation. Each child displayed a unique combination of disabilities that together formed a comprehensive catalog of what happens when human genetics are pushed beyond the limits of biological survival. The oldest child, Michael, born in 1996, showed relatively mild symptoms compared to his younger siblings. He had learning disabilities that prevented him from reading beyond a second grade level despite being 7 years old. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand. His coordination problems made simple tasks like tying shoes or writing nearly impossible. But compared to what would come later, Michael's condition seemed almost normal. The second child, born 6 months after Michael, displayed more severe developmental delays. She couldn't speak in complete sentences, despite being nearly 7 years old. Her motor skills were so impaired that she required assistance with basic activities like eating and dressing. She showed signs of autism-like behaviors, including repetitive rocking and an inability to make eye contact with strangers. The family interpreted her withdrawn behavior as evidence of special spiritual sensitivity rather than neurological damage. By the time the fourth and fifth children were born in 1998 and 1999, the genetic damage had escalated to levels that would have triggered immediate medical intervention in any normal family. The fourth child suffered from severe intellectual disabilities that left him functioning at the level of a toddler, despite being 4 years old. He had never learned to use the toilet independently and communicated only through primitive grunts and pointing. The fifth child's condition was even more devastating. Born with microcephaly, his head was significantly smaller than normal, and his brain development had been severely compromised. He experienced frequent seizures that the family treated through prayer rather than medical intervention. His cognitive abilities were so limited that he showed no recognition of family members and required constant supervision to prevent him from injuring himself. The middle children born between 2000 and 2001 represented the point where genetic collapse began to threaten basic survival. The seventh child was born with spina bifida, a condition where the spine fails to develop properly, leaving her partially paralyzed from the waist down. The family had constructed a crude wheelchair from wood and metal parts, but she received no physical therapy or medical treatment that might have improved her mobility. The eighth child suffered from multiple congenital heart defects that caused breathing difficulties and limited his ability to engage in any physical activity. His lips and fingernails showed a blue tint that indicated poor oxygen circulation, a condition that would have required immediate surgical intervention in any hospital setting. The family attributed his breathing problems to spiritual sensitivity and believed that his weakness was evidence of a pure soul too delicate for the physical world. The youngest children born after 2002 showed genetic damage so severe that their survival seemed almost miraculous to medical experts who later examined them. The 10th child was born with severe clubfoot deformities that left both feet twisted at impossible angles. She could only move by crawling or being carried by family members. The 11th child suffered from profound intellectual disabilities, combined with physical deformities that included malformed hands with webbed fingers and a cleft palate that made eating and speaking extremely difficult. The 12th and final child, born just months before the family's discovery, displayed the most extreme genetic abnormalities yet documented in the Coleman bloodline. His head was grotesquely enlarged due to hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid accumulates in the brain. His internal organs showed multiple defects that made normal digestion and breathing nearly impossible. He required constant care and showed no signs of cognitive development beyond the most basic reflexes. Throughout this progression of genetic catastrophe, the family maintained their belief that each child's disabilities were evidence of divine favor rather than biological consequences. They developed elaborate religious explanations for every condition, interpreting seizures as moments of divine communication, physical deformities as marks of spiritual election, and intellectual disabilities as evidence of souls too pure for earthly concerns. The family's complete avoidance of medical care meant that conditions that might have been treatable were allowed to worsen, while the children suffered without pain relief or therapeutic intervention. This medical neglect was presented to the children as evidence of their family's superior faith and rejection of worldly solutions to spiritual challenges, ensuring that even the older children who could understand their situation learned to view their suffering as evidence of God's special attention rather than preventable tragedy. Within 48 hours of Jennifer Hayes's initial discovery, the Coleman compound had become the center of the largest child welfare investigation in Kentucky state history. Social Services Director Robert Manning assembled a team that included genetic counselors, child psychologists, law enforcement specialists, and medical experts who had experience with cases involving systematic abuse and neglect. But nothing in their training had prepared them for the complex web of genetic manipulation and religious extremism that they encountered when they began formal interviews with the Coleman family members. The first challenge investigators faced was the family's complete inability to understand why their lifestyle was problematic. James and Daniel Coleman answered questions with genuine confusion about why authorities were interested in their religious practices. They explained their marriage arrangements using biblical quotations and theological arguments that presented incest as evidence of spiritual advancement rather than criminal behavior. When asked about the sharing system between wives, they described it as a sacred covenant that maximized God's blessing on their offspring while demonstrating their commitment to family unity above individual desires. Sarah and Mary Beth proved even more difficult to interview because their conditioning had been so complete that they genuinely believed their reproductive arrangements were evidence of divine favor. They spoke about their shared pregnancies and coordinated child-rearing as proof of their special status as chosen women who had been selected to concentrate God's genetics within a pure bloodline. When investigators pointed out the obvious genetic damage in their children, both women became defensive and insisted that the disabilities were signs of spiritual election rather than biological consequences of inbreeding. The children presented the most heartbreaking challenge for investigators because their severe disabilities and complete isolation had left them unable to understand normal family relationships or recognize their situation as abnormal. The older children who could communicate at all spoke about their family structure as the only reality they had ever known. They described their parents' sharing arrangements matter-of-factly and showed no awareness that other families operated differently. When asked about their own health problems, they repeated the religious explanations they had been taught, describing their seizures as moments of divine communication and their physical deformities as marks of God's special attention. Gathering physical evidence proved equally challenging because the family had operated in complete isolation for decades without creating the paper trails that typically documented abuse cases. There were no medical records because the family had avoided all professional health care. There were no school records because the children had never been enrolled in educational programs. There were no financial records that might have revealed suspicious patterns because the family was entirely self-sufficient. Investigators had to rely primarily on physical evidence of genetic damage and testimony from family members who had been conditioned to view their situation as religiously mandated rather than criminally abusive. The legal framework for prosecuting the case was complicated by the fact that Kentucky's incest laws had been written to address individual cases of sexual abuse rather than systematic breeding programs conducted under religious justification. Prosecutors struggled to determine which charges would be most appropriate for adults who genuinely believed they were following divine commands rather than committing crimes against their children. The religious dimension of the case created additional complications because the family's practices were presented as sincere theological beliefs rather than deliberate criminal activity. DNA testing became essential for establishing the true parentage of the 12 children and documenting the extent of genetic overlap that had created their disabilities. But even this scientific evidence was challenged by the family's religious beliefs, with all 4 adults insisting that God, rather than genetics, determined their children's characteristics, and that DNA testing represented faithless interference with divine will. The results of genetic analysis revealed patterns of inbreeding so extreme that they challenged scientific understanding of the minimum genetic diversity required for human reproduction. Mental health evaluations of the family members revealed the profound psychological damage that had resulted from decades of isolation and religious conditioning. The adults showed signs of delusional thinking and inability to distinguish between their religious beliefs and objective reality. The children displayed varying degrees of developmental trauma that went far beyond their genetic disabilities, to include emotional and psychological damage caused by their complete disconnection from normal human society. As the investigation expanded, authorities realized they were dealing with not just a case of child abuse, but a systematic experiment in human genetic manipulation that had been conducted without any understanding of the scientific principles involved or consideration for the welfare of the children who served as unwilling subjects in their parents' religious obsessions. The medical evaluation of the Coleman family began within 72 hours of their discovery and quickly became the most comprehensive genetic assessment ever conducted on a single family in Kentucky medical history. Dr. Patricia Morrison led a team of specialists who documented 43 distinct genetic abnormalities across the 12 children, ranging from relatively minor learning disabilities to catastrophic organ defects that threatened immediate survival. The medical team's preliminary report described the family as a living laboratory of inbreeding depression, with genetic damage so systematic and severe that it challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of human biological resilience. Each child required immediate medical intervention for conditions that had gone untreated for years, while the family relied on prayer and herbal remedies. The legal proceedings against James, Daniel, Sarah, and Mary Beth Coleman began with charges of child abuse, neglect, and incest. But prosecutors quickly discovered that Kentucky's legal framework was inadequate for addressing systematic breeding programs conducted under religious justification. The four adults genuinely believed they had been following divine commands rather than committing crimes, creating complex questions about criminal intent and religious freedom that had never been tested in court. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were victims of religious indoctrination rather than criminal masterminds, while prosecutors maintained that the systematic nature of the abuse demonstrated deliberate planning, regardless of religious motivation. The process of removing the children from the compound proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the intervention, because the family had been conditioned to view any outside interference as religious persecution. The older children who could understand what was happening cried and begged to remain with their family, genuinely believing that separation from their parents would result in spiritual contamination and eternal damnation. Social workers had to physically separate children from adults who clung to each other while praying for divine intervention to prevent what they saw as the destruction of their sacred family structure. Finding appropriate placements for 12 severely disabled children became an immediate crisis, because Kentucky's foster care system was not equipped to handle the specialized medical and educational needs that resulted from their genetic conditions and complete isolation from normal society. Many of the children required constant medical supervision, specialized equipment for mobility and communication, and therapeutic interventions that went far beyond what typical foster families could provide. The state was forced to place most of the children in institutional care facilities that could address their medical needs, but offered little hope for the kind of individual attention and family bonding that might have helped them recover from their traumatic backgrounds. The psychological evaluation of the family revealed the profound challenge of treating victims who had been systematically conditioned to protect their abusers and interpret intervention as evidence of spiritual attack rather than rescue. The children showed classic symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, defending their parents' actions and expressing genuine fear of being corrupted by contact with the outside world. Therapists struggled to help children understand concepts like normal family relationships and individual rights when their entire worldview had been constructed around collective family identity and religious duty to maintain genetic purity. The medical treatment of the children's genetic conditions proved only partially successful because many of the abnormalities were irreversible results of developmental damage that had occurred during fetal growth. Surgical interventions could address some physical deformities and mechanical problems, but intellectual disabilities and neurological damage could only be managed rather than cured. The children's complete lack of exposure to modern medical care meant that even routine procedures like vaccinations and dental work required careful preparation and psychological support to prevent additional trauma. The legal resolution of the case took nearly 2 years and resulted in convictions for all 4 adults on charges of child abuse and contributing to the delinquency of minors, though the incest charges were complicated by the family's sincere religious beliefs and the difficulty of proving criminal intent in cases involving systematic indoctrination. James and Daniel received sentences of 15 years in prison, while Sarah and Mary Beth were sentenced to 10 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 7 years if they completed psychological counseling and demonstrated understanding of the harm their actions had caused to their children. The ethical questions raised by the Coleman case extended far beyond the immediate legal issues to encompass fundamental questions about religious freedom, parental rights, and the state's responsibility to protect children from parents whose sincere beliefs resulted in systematic harm. Medical ethicists debated whether the case represented criminal abuse or religious extremism taken to its logical conclusion, while legal scholars struggled with the precedent of prosecuting parents for practices they genuinely believed were mandated by divine command rather than chosen for personal gratification or deliberate cruelty. 21 years after their discovery, the Coleman children have become adults whose lives serve as a permanent testament to the devastating consequences of systematic genetic manipulation and religious extremism. The oldest survivors, now in their 20s, continue to struggle with the dual burden of severe genetic disabilities and psychological damage that has made integration into normal society nearly impossible. Michael, the eldest, lives in a supervised group home where he receives assistance with basic daily tasks that his learning disabilities and coordination problems make challenging. Despite years of therapeutic intervention, he has never progressed beyond an elementary school level of cognitive function and requires constant supervision to navigate even simple social interactions. The middle children, now teenagers, face even more severe challenges because their genetic conditions were more extreme and their developmental delays more profound. Several require full-time institutional care because their intellectual disabilities and physical deformities make independent living impossible. The youngest survivors show the most devastating effects of their parents' breeding program, with multiple children remaining in vegetative states or requiring constant medical intervention to survive conditions that should have been fatal during infancy. 3 of the original 12 children did not survive to adulthood, succumbing to organ failures and complications related to their genetic abnormalities. The psychological legacy of their upbringing has proven as difficult to address as their physical disabilities. Even after 2 decades of therapeutic intervention, many of the survivors continue to struggle with concepts like individual identity and personal rights that conflict with the collective family ideology they learned during their early years. They have difficulty forming relationships outside their sibling group and show persistent anxiety about spiritual contamination from contact with people who don't share their genetic heritage. Several still express loyalty to their imprisoned parents and interpret their current living situations as temporary exile rather than permanent rescue from an abusive environment. The broader implications of the Coleman case have influenced policy changes in child protective services and law enforcement training throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. Social workers now receive specialized training in recognizing signs of systematic abuse in isolated religious communities, while medical professionals have developed protocols for identifying genetic damage that suggests deliberate inbreeding rather than random birth defects. The case has become a standard reference in genetic counseling programs and law enforcement academies as an example of how religious extremism can create systematic child abuse that operates outside normal detection systems. The scientific legacy of the Coleman family extends beyond their individual tragedy to contribute important data about the limits of human genetic resilience. Researchers have studied their DNA patterns to better understand how quickly genetic diversity can be eliminated through systematic inbreeding and what minimum levels of genetic variation are required for sustainable human reproduction. The family's genetic profiles have become valuable resources for understanding inherited diseases and developing treatments for genetic conditions that affect isolated populations around the world. The failure of social systems to detect and prevent the Coleman family's abuse has led to significant reforms in how authorities monitor isolated communities and respond to reports of unusual family structures. County social services departments now have protocols for conducting welfare checks in remote areas and training for recognizing signs of systematic abuse that might be hidden behind religious justifications. School districts have improved their truancy investigation procedures to ensure that children who disappear from educational systems receive follow-up attention rather than being written off as families who have moved away. The legal precedent established by the Coleman case has influenced how courts handle cases involving religious freedom and parental rights when children's welfare is at stake. The conviction of all 4 adults established that sincere religious belief cannot be used as a defense for systematic child abuse, regardless of how deeply held those beliefs might be, or how genuinely parents believe they are following divine commands. This precedent has been cited in subsequent cases involving religious communities where traditional practices conflict with child protection laws. The Coleman story serves as a permanent reminder that some of the most devastating forms of child abuse can occur in families where parents genuinely believe they are acting in their children's best interests. The systematic nature of their genetic manipulation demonstrates how religious extremism can create forms of harm that are more severe and long-lasting than impulsive acts of violence or neglect. Their case illustrates the critical importance of maintaining connections between isolated communities and mainstream society to prevent the development of closed systems where harmful practices can continue unchecked across multiple generations. The ongoing care requirements for the Coleman survivors represent a lifetime commitment from social services systems that must continue providing specialized medical and therapeutic support for adults whose genetic conditions and psychological damage will never fully heal. Their story challenges society to develop better methods for detecting systematic abuse in isolated communities while respecting legitimate religious diversity and family autonomy. The genetic horror that began with William Coleman's twisted religious vision continues to impact lives more than 2 decades after its discovery, serving as proof that some forms of child abuse create consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities and generations of families who must live with the results of systematic cruelty disguised as divine devotion. But the Coleman family's nightmare isn't the only case of systematic genetic horror hidden in America's remote communities. Tomorrow, I'm taking you inside another family compound where religious extremism created an even more disturbing breeding program that lasted for over 60 years. What happens when a charismatic leader convinces 3 generations of women that bearing children to their own sons is the path to salvation? The medical evidence will make the Coleman case look like just the beginning. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow's story will expose genetic manipulation so extreme that doctors still refuse to discuss the details publicly. Trust me, you're not prepared for what we're uncovering next.